Chapter 11, we'll be talking about performance-enhancing substances. And here we'll be talking about some of the most common ergogenic aids, which is any kind of substance that helps out with performance that most athletes and general population will be consuming. Okay, a lot of these are ones that athletes will be talking about. Some have taken, some have not, such as like most athletes have taken creatine. A lot of general population have taken creatine. That one is an okay substance. That's what I mean. Okay, it's allowed to steroids, anabolic steroids. That's one's not allowed. Some have taken this, some have not. But here we'll be just getting into the most common substances that athletes will be taking, ones you'll hear about, ones you'll have to discuss with your athletes about, and also cross over the recreational use as well. But anyways, we'll be getting into all that and talking about the usages here. Chapter 11, Performance-Enhancing Substances and Methods. Key definition here, ergogenic aid. Defined as any substance, mechanical aid, or training method that improves sport performance. For the purposes of this chapter, the term refers specifically to pharmacological aids. Similar to our term, a lot of times, supplements. Sports supplementation, a lot of different terms, but really there's a lot of different variances, but usually they fall in the ergogenic aids, and that's kind of the main term that we'll use, looking specifically at pharmacological, that is, drugs to consumables. An athlete's first priority should be to apply sound principles of training, including adequate nutrition, before using any nutritional supplement or ergogenic aid. Okay, this is a good point here. Consuming additional products or getting supplement in, it's kind of the word supplement. You're adding in what's not already being consumed. So a lot of times with supplements, we know why we take protein, to get more protein in. I also think carbohydrates could be a supplement to some extent. It's probably the best one for overall performance. I know I talk about it a lot, but it's true. But a lot of supplements, though, are being consumed. It says adequate nutrition. A lot of times people think if I take this extra ingredient in, that'll give some major impact along with it. But with adequate nutrition, a lot of times you're getting all that you need in. And so adding more is not necessarily going to benefit you. Having too much and too little is kind of the same thing. Too much may not benefit you, just like too little may not be benefiting you as well. Okay, and so it should be really up to the coach, for the ones that are allowed, I should say. Up to the coach, strength coach, position coach, kind of talking about what's the best approach here. Now, there's some, of course, i.e. anabolic steroids, that you can't talk with your coaches about because they're a banned substance. And really what makes them kind of, it was whatever the FDA has deemed safe and effective. So they haven't done that to steroids because, well, they're not safe and effective. Well, actually, we really don't know because we can't really test them. They're not as bad as, I'm not trying to promote the use of them, by the way, but there's a lot of misleading information about anabolic steroids that's not exactly true. So I think we should study them. It's kind of the gray area. They're not completely safe because there's no safe drug. Okay, some people could take too much vitamin C and have a very adverse effect. Okay, there is no safe drug out there, no matter what. And I've talked about this before, but there's always a risk-to-reward ratio. And everyone's different on this. Okay, but I do think we should study these banned substances, to kind of see really what's going on with them. I'm not advocating for them. I'm just saying we should learn more about it because there's a lot of misleading information regarding a lot of them. So types of performance-enhancing substances. Products that can be sold as dietary supplements as a product other than tobacco intended to supplement the diet. Must be intended for ingestion, cannot be advertised or used as a conventional food or as a sole item within a meal or diet. Contain one more of the following: vitamin, mineral, herb or botanical, amino acid, dietary substance for use by humans to supplement the diet by increasing total dietary intake, a concentrate, metabolite, constituent, extract, or combination of any of the above ingredients. And it says the distinction between a drug and a dietary supplement is linked to FDA approval for safety and effectiveness. So get into the main one. Anabolic steroids. Well, I should say, looking at hormone supplementation, the main hormone supplementation that we all think of is some form of anabolic steroids. And what it is it's a synthetic, that is man-made derivative of the male sex hormone, testosterone. And elevations of testosterone stimulate protein synthesis, resulting in improvements in muscle size, mass, and strength. All what we've talked about. And you can see right here, here's just a table of common steroids used by athletes. Some of the most common ones, you see the top are Dianabol and Anavar, Winstrol. Well, actually, take that back. Dianabol, Anavar, those are kind of your mass building, your mass building steroid. Winstrol, a little bit more of a cutting type steroid, so a lot more of a fat burner, thermogenic. And then you see the rest of the list there, not commonly as taken as those ones. The top four and Anadrol, those would be the top ones you hear about all the time. So those are orally taken. You can also do injectable. I know I kind of brought up earlier that in another lecture that testosterone mostly injected. Well, that's kind of the old days. Now, a lot of them are becoming more. And what I meant by that when I said that in the previous lecture was referring to injectable as kind of the more preferred, because what happens is when you consume it via pill form, it has to go into the digestion, go through the liver, and then gets filtrated out. So it puts more stress on the liver than injectable. But a lot of they're coming more and more, I guess, purer, you could say. And so a lot more orally taking as opposed to injecting, because there's a lot of risk with injecting as opposed to taking as a pill form. So more orally active steroids are being consumed that way via the injectables. What I meant by my last lecture, I forget which one I was talking about, is, you're only going to be injecting. It's just because what I meant by that was most prefer the injection because it preserves the liver a little bit more. But nonetheless, these are all banned substances. They're all legal to be taken in competition. Okay, and these are all from every sport. Well, they're supposed to be banned, but we know sports allow them to be consuming them. And this is one thing I wish they would make a better rule on, is either fully test all athletes and get it completely out of sports, or allow them to take it. I don't like the middle ground stuff. Okay, and so where I'm at with steroids, I don't think they should be in sports. I think they're not right, especially for kids, starting to see them get involved with them. I think they shouldn't be there. But I also don't think you should only allow some to be taking it and some not. Test everyone, make sure you get it out of sports, or let them all take it. I hate the middle ground approach on this. Dosing, says athletes typically they'll stack steroids in a regimen in which they administer several different drugs simultaneously. A lot of times you'll see that they'll do injection and oral, kind of stacking them. Injection is going to be a little bit more potent because you're getting it. Well, let me put it this way: if you know you're getting a pure synthetic, there's no other additives adding into it, injecting it gets right into the bloodstream and then it starts being targeting at that point. Problem is, most people know what they're getting, and so who knows exactly what you're injecting into your system. But that being said, a lot of stacking is going to be done via, could be doing both, or it might be taking two different types of pills at once, or stacking is just taking multiple drugs at once. It says the potency of one anabolic agent may be enhanced and consumed with another. Most users use the drugs for several weeks or months and alternate these cycles with periods of discontinued use. Often athletes administer the drugs in a pyramid, in which dosages are steadily increased over several weeks. Toward the end of the cycle, the athlete steps down to reduce the likelihood of negative side effects. And that's what they refer to as cycling. And so they'll do these periods of cycling, and then actually one for like the Olympics, they'll start to cycle off pretty, within I think a couple months. I'm not sure exactly on this, but for Olympic weightlifting. And actually what you're seeing the Olympic weightlifters do in competition, especially for countries like everyone but the U.S., because the U.S. is the only country in the world that has their Olympic weightlifters tested regularly by governmental officials. And so now the Olympic Committee will test, but there's ways around all that. Like you take Russia, 2016, Russia didn't have any athletes at the Olympics because they were all busted for doping. But like Olympic weightlifting, for instance, you'll have, these officials from the Olympic Committee will come in, they'll test, but they'll use urine from non-lifters in there. They'll get, because that's the main way you'll test, is you'll take a urine sample, and then it's not so much is there testosterone in urine or not, it's a ratio. Too much testosterone in the ratio then will signal like there's on something. And so they'll have people go in and they'll hide vials of pee somewhere and this is all true. They'll hide vials of urine in the stall. They'll use that. Sometimes they have body doubles go in and pee for the athletes. There's a lot of ways around these countries get around, but there comes a point when they can't, and that's when they get busted. That's what happened to Russia in 2016, and they didn't even compete there. But nonetheless, what you'll see with the Olympic weightlifters is they're actually cycling. They've cycled way off their drugs by the time they go to compete in the Olympics. And what they're doing in the Olympics is far less than what they were doing months before when they're coming off their cycles. So like, who uses this? Well, everyone in terms of athletics. And you're seeing a lot in high schools too. And there's a lot of pressure on high school athletes to try and be the best, to try and get that scholarship and all that. So I don't want high school kids taking drugs. I don't think anyone should be taking steroids in competition. If you want to do it on your own, it's your choice. Okay, it's your life. Do what you want to do. But I don't think it should be in sports, especially with high school kids competing. But there's a lot of pressure, even collegiate, professional, trying to make to the next level. And there's always somebody better than you. And so you got to keep up with them somehow. So I see why they want to take it, because they're so driven to compete. They'll do anything. I just think it should be steered away from, especially in high school. And of course, you say money not involved with sports, so they'll use it to improve their parents. Which if that's what you want to do, that's your life. As long as I don't have to pay for any kind of medical bills or pay for any of your stuff, do what you want to do. Just don't make me pay for it. So those who want to gain muscle mass and strength, because that's what taking synthetic testosterone is going to help do, is increase protein synthesis, therefore leading to muscle strength, muscle gain, so gaining lean body mass. You see here changes in lean body mass with anabolic steroid administration and following drug cessation. You can just see the decadurabolin. That's just, it was on the slide earlier, but you can just see that compared to a placebo. Significant difference in fat-free mass after 8 weeks of training, and then let alone once you cycle off, still got those greater fat-free mass increases. So then performance says the purported ergogenic benefits commonly attributed to anabolic steroid use are increased muscle mass, strength, athletic performance. But these changes depend on training status of the individual. Okay, they're only going to work if you train and you can competing. That's what based on different individuals. Okay, if you're not training hard, you're not doing right, they're not going to really have any benefit for you. That's why guys who are taking it, they do see significant changes because they're training hard. So therefore, it does lead to increased performance. Now, there's a psychological effect. It says anabolic steroid use is associated with changes in aggression, arousal, and irritability. This is what everyone thinks of. We talk about quote unquote roid rage. Well, what you kind of see with steroids is not everyone who takes it turns into this roid monster. If somebody is naturally more aggressive and more irritable, steroids are more or less going to increase those attributes. If you're not, you might get a little more irritable, a little more aggressive by taking, because that's what testosterone does to males. Get a group of guys around one another, what do they start doing? They start arguing, start wrestling. They want to try and attack one another. It's nature. Testosterone does that to males. So those who are, naturally not as aggressive and irritable, you might see a little bit change in that, but you're not going to take somebody who's, a calm person and they turn into a roid monster. Okay, so there's a lot of misnomers around the psychological effects of steroids. Now, long-term usage, though, this is why a lot of people will start taking it for aesthetics, because it's considered a drug like anything else. You get a high off it, you don't want the high to go away. So once someone gets on it, a lot of times they're doing it year in, year out over a long span. And as for the psychological effects over the long term, we're not too sure. Okay, so just kind of keep in mind that, with the increased testosterone, you will see a change in aggression and irritability, but it's not going to be to the extent that the media and everyone thinks. You're not going to turn into some crazy roid monster just because you've taken a cycle of steroids. Unless you're already that crazy to begin with, then it will probably enhance that. It says adverse effects. It says that medical problems may be somewhat overstated. Many of the side effects linked to abuse are reversible upon cessation. Side effects differ between steroid use under medical supervision and many drugs at higher dosages. So we really don't know. Now, there is a pretty good amount of literature showing that the anabolic steroids do lead to cardiovascular health effects over the long term. Okay, probably because of raising blood pressure is one that it does help. Raise the blood pressure. So therefore, that over term, the hypertension does lead to cardiovascular effects. So there is some medical effects with it. Okay, they're probably overstated, but they're not nothing. Okay, so it's something, like I said, there's always a risk to reward. Doing a cycle or a couple cycles will probably, once you get off them, all the effects will reverse, go back to normal. It's the long-term usage that we don't know about. We do know there are some major health effects going along with it, but we're not entirely sure the exact long-term effects of steroid use. Then you have testosterone precursors, so prohormones. Although performance changes may not occur with prohormone use, athletes may have a higher risk for experiencing adverse side effects similar to those associated with anabolic steroid use. So one example is a human chorionic gonadotropin. So human chorionic gonadotropin. This is when injected in the men, this drug or this hormone can increase testicular testosterone production. So the efficacy, cited anecdotally as useful for males who take anabolic steroids. And you got endogenous testosterone production is suppressed at the end of a steroid cycle. If HCG is used by athletes, it's likely used by those who are finishing a cycle of anabolic steroids and are looking to activate their own endogenous testosterone production. So you'll see, especially when you get towards the end of a cycle, a lot of times what guys will do is they'll start as they're cycling off, they'll start consuming other hormones or blockers to kind of keep the levels from completely switching out. So this is one example here, but another one is they'll start to take an estrogen blocker, because as testosterone raises, estrogen raises as well. Men, just like women, we both have the opposite sex hormone in us. So men still have estrogen, women have testosterone. It's just the amounts of what we produce is different. And so as testosterone gets raised up, estrogen in males are going to get raised up as well. So what a lot of guys will do is they'll take an estrogen blocker, because if you cut the testosterone, well, estrogen is still at a high level. So you need to block that somehow. That way you can get those levels back down to normal as well. Because you don't want in males have that estrogen being high, because it has the adverse effects of testosterone. And so a lot of times you'll do is you'll cycle, as you're coming off a cycle, start taking other, pro hormones, start getting the body naturally start ramping up to a newer baseline than where it once was. There's a little research on the side effects of these injections. The side effects are common injection are pain, swelling, and tenderness around the injection site. Insulin. I know I've talked a little bit about this, but it's one of the most anabolic hormones the body makes. We know it facilitates the uptake of glucose and amino acids, and the efficacy is several reports that post-workout carbohydrate ingestion suppresses muscle protein breakdown via the anti-catabolic effects of insulin. So, if protein breakdown suppressed over several weeks to months, gains in lean muscle mass could be realized. So, guys will take inject insulin, I should say, along with the high carbohydrate, high protein, especially, meal, especially post-workout, because then the insulin will help facilitate the uptake of glucose. And I will keep saying amino acids like the little brother, they'll follow along with it, the glucose into the cell. Now, major effects. Well, one, not everyone's going to have this, but there's a chance of immediate death. Okay, if you produce enough insulin and you're not insulin resistant, adding more insulin in could throw the body off too much, where it could cause immediate death. It could put you into a coma. Okay, and so these are some major things that you got to be careful about, and before you start just taking this insulin, just in order to try and gain some muscle mass. Okay, there's major effects that could happen from here. And lastly, another possible adverse effect would be the development of insulin-dependent diabetes. And this would be seen in a healthy individual suddenly start to develop these negative health effects. Okay, and so taking an insulin when not diabetic is going to throw some major problems in if you're not careful. And I would recommend most people are taking insulin will be along the bodybuilding arena, okay, because they want to try and maximize as much as possible. Most athletes generally won't be taking insulin unless they are diabetic. Okay, and so that being said, there's some major problems like death, coma, developing diabetes in a healthy individual that wouldn't be seen if they weren't consuming insulin in this fashion. Next, growth hormone, which I'm not going to spend a whole lot on this just because we've already talked about it. We know it does stimulate bone and skeletal muscle growth, helps maintain blood glucose levels, and also stimulates fatty acid release from fats, so increases lipolysis. That's why a lot of take it is because it helps burn fat and build muscle. A little research has been done with athletes. There's been a lot done in general population across the board. We see that you see the listings here, it does help with improvements in lean tissue and decrease in body fat. Excess HGH after puberty can cause acromegaly. And this is a disfiguring disease characterized by a widening of the bones, arthritis, organ enlargement, and metabolic abnormalities. You see a lot of times with bodybuilders, they get what we call the GH belly, that they have that six-pack abs, but then their stomach sticks way out. That's because their organs have gotten larger from the use of HGH. says abuse of HGH can also lead to diabetes in prone individuals, cardiovascular dysfunction, muscle, joint, and bone pain, hypertension, abnormal growth of organs, and accelerated osteoarthritis. So there's a larger major side effects. Despite little research done with athletes, we do know that there is a lot of adverse effects to consuming HGH following puberty. You got erythropoietin, EPO. This is one of the major doping drugs that we saw with Lance Armstrong, and with the whole cycling is prevalent all through the entire cycling community. So erythropoietin is a hormone in the body that stimulates red blood cell growth. And so the reason why you take it is because red blood cells, especially endurance type events, the more red blood cells, the more oxygen carrying capability, coupled with the elite status of these athletes, have the high mitochondria, the enzymes, those pathways. So the more oxygen available, then could then get into metabolism, get into the pathways, the mitochondria, and then therefore be just a greater amount of energy, less fatigue. And so they'll actually inject with EPO, and this is associated with elevations of both hematocrit and hemoglobin. Another thing they might do too, blood doping. They'll take out, an individual will take out whole blood, they'll spin it down, separate out plasma from the red blood cells, and so then they'll discard the plasma, but they'll hang on the red blood cells, and then right before the event, they'll re-inject the red blood cells back in the body, so therefore you're getting a huge influx of those cells into the body. Both EPO doping and blood doping are outlawed by the Olympic training community. Health risks include increased risk of blood clotting, elevations in systolic blood pressure, compromised thermoregulatory system, and dehydration during aerobic and endurance events. Next, you have beta-adrenergic agonists. And then these can increase lean mass and decrease stored fat. What these do is that they mimic certain neurotransmitters or catecholamines, i.e. they mimic epinephrine. And so that just stimulates a lot of reactions in the body, speeding up a lot of reactions that we've talked about already. We'll see, though, does increase lean mass, could decrease stored fat. One, that a lot of different over-the-counter drugs used to sell them. Your antihistamines used to have this in there, but they would be sold as clenbuterol. Clenbuterol is a banned substance that a lot of females would take because it helps out with increasing lean mass and decreasing body fat. So if you hear people talking about clenbuterol, that's what they're taking. And you got beta blockers. This reduced anxiety and tremors during performance because what they do is they block the receptor sites. Well, this goes against what we just talked about, the beta-adrenergic agonists. So beta blockers basically block the receptors for those beta agonists. That is catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And so a lot of, if you're competing in some kind of event where you need to really calm yourself, some known to take beta blockers. If you watch the Bigger, Faster, Stronger, the documentary on steroids, there is some people in symphonies that will take beta blockers before they go out and perform with their instrument, calm them down. So there's a lot of different things for ergogenic A's doping that's just not athletics. Now getting into dietary supplements, the main one we always think of is protein. And here, amino acids, kind of broken into essential and branched chain. So essential, if you remember, are ones that we can't make, so we have to consume in the diet. And then those are further broken into the BCAAs, leucine, isoleucine, and valine. Okay, and we need to consume enough. And if you eat a normal diet, you probably get 4 daily activity, get enough amino acids, the essential amino acids in. Okay, eating a well-balanced diet, enough lean meats, you get enough in. Now, for sports, like we've talked about, competition, you're going to boost up how much you're actually taking. And within consuming animal meat, you get enough of the BCAAs in there. Some start supplement out even more because you can see right here, leucine is one of the most important ones it really gets activated in muscle and protein synthesis. So there's a pathway right here is consumption of leucine via training. So you got the stimulus. There's activation of muscle-specific genes, which just specifically increases in the AKT or the mTOR. If you ever see mTOR, stands for mammalian target of rapamycin, the pathway there, which is just a pathway for the increase in protein synthesis. And so the more leucine you consume will help out with that pathway, given that you are stimulating enough, that is resistance training program. And over time, you get the hypertrophic responses. So it's important that you do get the BCAAs in. Okay, and it says branched chain amino acids, leucine is a key regulator in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And that's true. Now, consuming more than you actually need is not necessarily going to speed up all this as well. Okay, if you're eating roughly 1 gram per pound of body weight and maybe a little bit more, you're probably getting all the BCAAs that you need in your diet to be effective. Okay, the research isn't really sold on if I consume out just leucine or just the BCAAs altogether, does it add in extra benefit? So my recommendation with these is, and like I said in the last video, or it's talking about BCAAs as a pre-workout. They start taking that not really as an energy stimulant, it's more or less just helping out with getting in for recovery and building up. And I always say my recommendation is for here, consume enough protein throughout the day. You're getting what you need. And if you want to take a little bit more, it's not going to hurt you, but don't feel that you have to go out and buy BCAAs. Okay, if you're taking, whey protein coupled with a high protein diet, you're getting enough to what you need to continue on. You got arginine. So L-arginine, you'll see in your pre-workouts, this is the main ingredient in there. Well, that and caffeine. We'll get into caffeine here a bit. So we talk about nitric oxide boosters, and these pre-workouts say nitric oxide blaster or whatever the stupid terminology they have. You actually don't have nitric oxide in, you don't consume that in your pre-workouts. What you're consuming is L-arginine, because L-arginine is a precursor to nitric oxide. And we should know by now nitric oxide is a very potent vasodilator. And so what happens is they put L-arginine in there in a lot in the pre-workout, hoping that when it gets in digestion, then it'll help out with NO release. And so here's the claims. Elevation of nitric oxide levels, increase in blood flow, improvement in exercise performance. However, they say little scientific evidence. I would even argue almost zero for dietary supplement arginine. Okay, they've done reports where they put in like 18 grams, I think, 15 to 18 grams injected into the blood of L-arginine, and they saw no increase in nitric oxide. The reason being is because we go back to supplements or our bioenergetics. We talked about substrates. You're only going to use a substrate if you have the enzyme. And so the enzyme is NO synthase. That's the enzyme that catalyzes L-arginine to nitric oxide. If there's no reason for that enzyme to speed up, there's not going to be any reason to get more nitric oxide. And also with that, most people take a pre-workout to get the increase in blood flow while going and doing an anaerobic exercise. Okay, anaerobically speaking, you don't need oxygen to lift. Okay, anaerobic means without oxygen. So why take supplements going to increase oxygen flow when you don't need it? Okay, and I hope you know what I'm trying to say right here. It's not that you don't need blood, you don't need oxygen. It's just we're speaking metabolically here. Exercise by itself is a vasodilator. So if you want to get proper blood flow, just start exercising. You'll get all you need for blood flow in there. Okay, pre-workouts, you want to take them, that's fine. But what you're really getting is the caffeine. That's the main thing in there that's getting you fired up to go train. Okay, the NO, all that stuff, that's just all marketing gimmick to make us all guilty. I've been buying it for 20 years now. I used to buy NO Explode way back in the day when they used to have the old school yellow top bottles and a weird blue label when it first came out. Way before Ronnie Coleman or Jay Cup. Yeah, Ronnie Coleman started being the spokesman for it. Okay, so point being, L-arginine is what you're getting in the pre-workout. That's supposed to be the nitric oxide blaster or whatever. That's a precursor to NO. But if you don't need to go through the reaction, it's not going to. So then a lot of that L-arginine will more or less be converted into whatever else you need, as opposed to converted into nitric oxide. Next, and this next one does have some pretty good evidence for it. Beta-hydroxy beta-methylbutyrate, HMB. And they've seen this a lot with older men when testosterone starts to really decrease for men. And so it's been shown to have an anabolic and lipolytic effect. Research is limited, but the research, like I said, there is support for older men. It says recent studies do not support supplementation in resistance-trained athletes. That's true. It says most effective when a training stimulus is provided. And so they didn't put it in here, but let you know, like, yeah, you look at the research for most younger men, for hardcore trainers, not going to see so much of a help with this. But for older men, when testosterone is really decreased, they've seen HMB to be, a possible, has shown some efficacy with it. I'm not sure they cut off in those studies for ages. I do want to say a lot of the men were 40s and 50s. Getting up there in age, that's where they've seen it happen. Next, you have beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is a muscle buffer, and it's a precursor to carnosine. And when taken about 2 grams, it's shown to have some efficacy, that it does help out buffering out the muscle and the blood and maintaining a proper pH within the system. Those who have taken it have probably experienced the effect of beta-alanine. When you take it, it gives you that tingling, itchy feeling in the skin. That's termed paresthesia. And so a lot of pre-workouts now have that, and a lot of people feel uncomfortable a little bit when you consume it because it gives you that tingling sensation, skin kind of irritation for a bit, but that doesn't last too long. But nonetheless, about 2 grams, it does show to have some effect and helps out with buffering out the muscle and into the blood. Then you got sodium bicarbonate. If you ever looked on the back of a box of baking soda, this is the main ingredient in baking soda. And so sodium bicarbonate, if you go back to your ex-phys days, bicarbonate is how we transport CO2 in the blood. And so by adding in sodium bicarbonate, it's another buffering agent as well. And so it helps out carrying the pH, or the hydrogens, lowering the pH, raising the pH in the blood to maintain a proper buffering capacity. Problem, though, with sodium bicarbonate is too much causes diarrhea, nausea, major stomach issues. So they say on this, no more than 0.3 grams per kilogram. And I did this, was part of my dissertation. And guys complain to me all the time because their stomach hurt, and a lot of times there's too much sodium bicarbonate. When you got to go to the bathroom, it's not like I have a little stomach cramp, I need to go to the restroom. It's like I have 5 seconds to go to the bathroom before it's everywhere. I know that's gross, but that's the real effect of sodium bicarbonate. A lot of evidence supporting it, but you need to keep the proper dosing. And they say really anything below 0.2 grams per kilogram is not really effective. So really it's around that 0.3 is where it shows to be really effective. And you got sodium citrate, which is kind of like sodium bicarbonate. It's not an actual base. So sodium bicarbonate is a base. And so it's an antioxidant. So it helps block or helps reduce acidity. So sodium citrate is not a base, but it does is it helps, once in the blood, it breaks down into bicarbonate, which then helps out with acidity. So it's kind of like a couple-step process to help reduce acidity. And there's some evidence, not so much. It's kind of in between on terms of the real efficacy with it. Then you have L-carnitine. If you go back to ex-phys, carnitine is a transporter of long-chain free fatty acids into the mitochondria. And so the more carnitine in theory means the more fatty acid being able to be transported into the mitochondria. So there's not a clear efficacy shown on here in lipid oxidation. Reason being, to use lipids, there's a lot more than just carnitine. You need mitochondria, you need enzymes. You need the actual enzyme that converts L-carnitine and puts L-carnitine onto the fatty acid. If there's no reason for those enzymes to work, Doesn't matter how much substrate you have. If the enzymes are not going to work, then there's not going to be a reaction. So dumping L-carnitine in, if you don't have the right enzymes to convert it all over to get attached to free fatty acid, there's no need to then put in the mitochondria because you're not having the reaction occur. So if you're not trained, no mitochondria, no enzymes, all that, more carnitine is not necessarily going to help out. It says it may enhance recovery from exercise, but once again, that's just the theories, the promoted effects, but there's not really any sound evidence on all that. But that's what they're kind of looking at right now, is kind of looking at the recovery aspect as opposed to the lipolytic effect. Last few ones, looking at the one that everyone's been taking probably their whole life. Probably the most studied supplement in history, creatine. So going back to bioenergetics, creatine phosphate is the main substrate for ATP production in the immediate or the ATP PCR system. And so with supplementation, it says it can increase the content by about 20%, but there's a saturation limit. Creatine, out of all supplements, has shown to have the most. We can see the bottom part. Studies consistently show significant ergogenic benefits. Reason being is because we don't store enough creatine phosphate in the cell. And so I've been told that in order to get the amount we can to saturate the cell, then we need to consume about 9 pounds of meat a day, which is really next to impossible to do. Okay, so that's why supplementing, and this is how supplements work. If you're deficient in something, then it's probably going to work. If you're not deficient, then it's not going to work. There's a reason why creatine works, is because most all of us are deficient in it. We don't have enough. Why does vitamin D work throughout a lot of the studies? It's because we're all deficient in vitamin D. Now, creatine only really works in about 20% of the population, but that's okay. Because if you have a team taking it, that 20% might be your star players. And the more creatine phosphate in the cell, the more ATP can be produced, the less you're going to produce those other byproducts, such as ammonia. And the less, especially in a power type sport, strength power sport, you can maintain performing at the same level. You can see the key points here. Oh, real quick, it's in terms of dosing, a lot of people take it as maintenance. That is, well, you do a loading phase in the maintenance. That is, you do 1 week of 20 grams a day, and then 5 grams a day after that as a maintenance. Some people think, and I kind of like this idea, is you do 1 week of 20 grams every day. That's the upper limit we've seen, is 20 grams. Okay, anything more than that has not been shown to be ineffective. It just hasn't shown to do any more. Once you hit 20 grams a day, that's about all the body can handle. It's not going to hurt you at all. It's just not going to be, you're just wasting at that point. But some people argue that take 20 grams a day for a week, do that 1 week, like 4 times a year. So basically you build your stores back up, let them come back down over time, build back up, come back down, kind of keeping the body in this regular cycle like that. You can also just take 1 week of loading and then do 5 grams every day as maintenance. The creatine phosphate is cheap. It's like $20 for like 5 pounds, 3 pounds. Okay, when you look at the creatine though, creatine monohydrate is the most effective. It's the one that shows to be the best, and it's the cheapest. You have creatine ethyl esters, you have creatine alkalines, you have tons of other creatines, way more money. All the data suggests that monohydrate is the most effective and it's the cheapest. Just go with that. And it says it's been shown to increase strength, power, and lean body mass in trained and untrained people. So it really has shown to be very beneficial in terms of the benefits, with relatively safe and inexpensive. Prolonged creatine has been generally associated with increase in body weight. It says especially in fat-free mass, which is not a bad thing because there's the lean mass coming about. You might see some increases in water weight, not really, a little bit. So not really a problem there. In adverse effects, there's not really been any documentation of a negative side effect from creatine. It says you might get some gastrointestinal disturbances, strain in the kidneys, but really it's nothing serious, and there's been really nothing bad that's been shown in terms of creatine supplementation. Okay, they say the media's reported that it's lead to dehydration and cramping. That's all anecdotally. That means there's no sound data supporting that at all. And so there's really no reason to believe that creatine enhances the risk for these side effects. So that being said, creatine is something if you want to try. There's really it's not really a bad thing to try if you want to try and see if it increases strength and lean body mass. Okay, if you're not training hard, there's no point in taking it really. That is, if you're not competing. But if you want to get stronger, even if you're not an athlete, if you're trying to get stronger and try and build up, yeah, give it a shot. It's cheap and very relatively, it's cheap. And then it's also shown to have no side effects. Caffeine. We're not real sure actually on how caffeine does work, but we have documented, and it's kind of like it's not quite as documented working as creatine, but there's still a lot of evidence saying that it does increase performance. Here it says increases time to exhaustion. A lot of studies have shown that does help out with those time trials. Unclear in sprint power performance, but for the longer duration, a lot of evidence supporting it. You can see some of the adverse effects. Just like anything, there's always going to be a risk to reward. So you might have some adverse effects if you're not very tolerant of caffeine. But nonetheless, we're not too sure exactly how it all does work. And it's fascinating because caffeine's used so much. In NCAA, you can only have so much throughout the week. There's a limit to what they allow you to have. Definitely warranted for a lot more studying. Some think it has an effect on the excitation, contraction coupling. It might have some kind of neuromuscular transmission impact. There's a lot that's shown that helps out with increasing lipids for, lipolysis. So there's a lot of things to study it. We just, need to keep studying. It's just, it's kind of hard to study, but nonetheless, it's definitely a lot more room to keep learning about this in terms of sports performance. When you're taking a pre-workout, the thing that's really working in there is your caffeine. Okay, that's the main ingredient that's really making you feel jacked up and fired up and ready to go. So it's effective for increasing resistance training, volume, performance. That's the efficacy, I should say. There's also other types of exercise, Wingate taste, speed of jelly, not responsive to energy and consumption. Partly because if you go back, you could see we talked about if caffeine's dealing with neuromuscular issues, transmission, affecting that, well, if you're already going into a high intensity type workout, that's adding that stimulus. And if you're throwing caffeine, it's a greater stimulus. So a lot of times mixing the two together makes people feel really bad. I've tried consuming energy drinks before going to jiu-jitsu, and it's some of the worst training I've ever had. You just feel terrible. It's just too much counteracting one in there. And so due to the presence of caffeine, the same potential adverse effects that exist for caffeine also exist for energy drinks, because that's one of the main ingredients in there is caffeine. Then you got ephedrine, which comes from the ephedra plant. This is the main ingredient here. It is very similar to caffeine. And it used to be, before 2004, it was sold as an ergogenic, take as a pre-workout basically. And it worked amazingly. It was awesome. Loved it. But in the early 2000s, people were dying off because they were taking way too much of it, because it's a very potent stimulant, much more potent than caffeine. A lot of times it was taken in combination with caffeine. And so people were dying off it. So in 2004, they banned ephedrine. So it's also shown to improve aerobic endurance performance, kind of like caffeine as well. You can see the adverse effects, many, and death was one of them. And it's then banned by most governing bodies, including the National Olympic Committee. And it's too bad because it was a great workout, but nonetheless, it was a very big health issue. And the last one, citrus, oranitum. So this was known as bitter orange, as kind of the common name. And this one helped to contribute to appetite suppression, increased metabolic rate, and lipolysis. And of course, combined with caffeine, other herbal products, significant improvements in time to fatigue reported. However, it's on the NCAA list of banned performance-enhancing drugs, much like a lot of these are. Creatine's allowed, protein, that's okay. Of course, steroids are not. Caffeine, though, and I don't have the data in front of me, but there is a limit that the NCAA allows athletes to have in terms of caffeine. To sum up this chapter, just keep in mind what an ergogenic aid is. The definition, that is any kind of substance that helps out the sports performance. And within our purposes, we talking about a pharmacological agent. Okay, all the major ones, steroids, or I should say anabolic hormones, that is testosterone, growth hormone, other dietary supplements, creatine, amino acid, so protein, and you got all the other different ones we discuss in here. So just make sure you know all of them, know the basis of how they work, what they are, and the dosages that we talked about. Keep that all in mind because you will be asked about this from your athletes. They'll talk to you about this, like, hey, what about this supplement? What should I do with here? You need to be able to discuss with them the safety, the efficacy, the effects, the adverse effects, I should say. Okay, so you make sure you know all the pros and the cons of all the major ergogenic aids that are coming out there. No, some are healthy, some we don't know about. Creatine is relatively healthy. Consuming protein, amino acids, that's okay. Those are all dietary intakes that are fine. But then you got anabolic steroids, which, well, we know the negative effects of those. And so just be familiar with all of them, know the basis of what we talked about, the dosaging, why take them, the pros and cons of each of them.